It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, even when you're standing near the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a warning, brushing against the wooden walls of the small birthing hut where you stood with sleeves rolled up and jaw clenched. You'd done this dozens of times before, more probably. You stopped counting after your 50th child cried into life, but tonight something felt different. The mother had been in labor for hours, too long. Her screams had faded into groans, then silence. Her husband stood outside, muttering prayers into the sleeve of his coat. Inside, only the crackling fire and the sound of shallow breathing filled the room. You whispered to her, gently encouraging her to push once more. Her hands gripped yours, too weak to even cry out. Then the baby came, limp, still. A soft thud against the linen cloth and a silence that stabbed through the air like a knife. You did everything you could. Fingers worked on instinct, checking for a pulse, clearing the airway, pressing your ear against the baby's tiny chest. But there was no movement, no flicker, no breath. Your hands were shaking now, not from the cold, but from the knowing. The kind of knowing midwives never speak of. The kind we bury beneath our ribs and lock behind our teeth. The mother didn't scream. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes wide and glassy. Her chest rose and fell with labored breath. You told her she made it. You told her she was safe. But the baby, he was gone, and for a long time, neither of you said anything. Then came the footsteps. They had gathered outside. Family, neighbors, a few from the church. They stood in silence when you opened the door. You held the child close, wrapped in white linen, heart pounding against the stillness. You said the words you had to say. He didn't make it. But they didn't look at the baby. They looked at you. Their eyes weren't sad. They were cold, suspicious. One woman clutched her necklace tighter. Another made the sign of the cross. They didn't speak, not at first, but in the still air between you and them, something broke. A shift you could feel in your spine. The father didn't cry. He took the bundle into his arms without meeting your gaze. Someone asked quietly, did she pray the right way? Another whispered, was the child cursed? You stepped back. You knew that sound. It was the beginning of a rumor. And once a rumor starts, especially in a village like this, truth doesn't matter anymore. Only fear. It started with a murmur. Low, hushed words traded over firewood piles and between bread loaves. They didn't say your name, not at first, just her, or the midwife. Their eyes, once warm with gratitude, now avoided yours, shifting like they were hiding some silent agreement. The mother of the dead child, Marta, hadn't spoken a word since the burial. She sat at her doorstep, rocking slightly, holding a small knitted blanket in her lap that no longer had a baby to cover. And while she said nothing, it was her silence that fueled the village's fire. People filled in the blanks. She must be in shock, they said, or maybe she knows something she's afraid to say. By the end of that week, a new version of the night began to take shape. You heard it first from Tomas, the baker's boy. They say the baby was cursed, he mumbled, unable to meet your gaze. That it wasn't a normal birth, that maybe you did something wrong. Wrong, you wanted to scream, you had done everything right. The baby hadn't breathed, sometimes that just happens, but the village didn't believe in sometimes. They believed in cause, in balance. If a baby died, it meant someone tipped the scales. Then came the old stories, revived from the dusty corners of frightened minds. Her grandmother was strange too, muttered the widow Salma. Lived alone, spoke to herbs, had a crow that followed her around. You tried to defend yourself. You tried to explain that midwifery was not magic, it was science, care, instinct. But the moment you raised your voice, they flinched, as if your words were spells and their ears were cursed by listening. Even the children stopped playing near your cottage. One left a bundle of sticks in the shape of a cross at your doorstep. Another threw a stone at your window and ran off giggling, except it didn't feel like a joke. What cut deepest wasn't the fear, it was the forgetting. These were people you had served for years. You decaught their babies, bandaged their wounds, sat with their dying. Now their glances slid off you like you were invisible. No, worse than invisible. Dangerous, and at night the whispers grew closer. You'd lie in bed, barely breathing, and hear footsteps outside. Not once, not twice, almost every night now. They never knocked, they never spoke. But sometimes, when the wind blew just right, you could swear you heard your name, spoken in a voice not meant to be heard. A warning or a curse. They were starting to believe you were something you were. And you were beginning to wonder how long it would take before even you started to believe it too. The first time she noticed Father Anselm watching her, it was during Mass. He didn't bow his head in prayer like he usually did. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed, sharp and motionless, as if memorizing her breathing. At first, she thought it was nothing. Perhaps grief made her imagine things, but then it happened again and again. Each sermon felt less like worship and more like a subtle trial. He began to mention her not by name but by description. There are those among us, he said one Sunday, voice thick with insinuation, who pretend to bring life but bring death. Who speak to herbs more than to God, who whisper to the blood and expect it to obey. The congregation didn't say anything aloud, but she could feel the shift. Heads didn't turn toward her, but they lined slightly away. Neighbors who used to greet her with warm loaves now crossed themselves as she passed. At the market, she overheard two women whispering by the garlic stall, "I told her not to let that woman in. Look what happened, dead as winter." Their voices dropped when they noticed her, but it was too late. The seed had been sown. Her name now carried the taste of suspicion. Later that week, a note was slipped under her door. Written in crude charcoal and pressed into the paper so hard it tore. "One child lost, how many more must die?" She didn't sleep that night, not because of fear for herself, but because she had tended to births for 20 years. Because her hands had caught first breaths and final cries, and now those same hands were seen as unclean, profane, as though something inside her had turned dark. Then came the summons. A boy no older than 10, wide-eyed and out of breath, came to her cottage at dawn. "Father Anselm says you are to speak before the council." He did not wait for her response before running off, as if afraid her shadow might reach him. She knew then this wasn't grief, this was preparation. They weren't mourning the baby anymore. They were preparing to bury her instead. They didn't call it a trial. They called it a gathering of concern, as if concern were something warm and soft, something shared over soup and murmured prayers. They said it was a meeting, a conversation among reasonable people, a way to set things straight, but you knew better. You knew what a noose looked like, even when it came dressed in kind words and folded hands. The town hall had never felt this cold before. The walls were the same stone that had stood for generations, but tonight they seemed to lean in. Dampness clung to your boots, crept up your spine. The air smelled of old oil, burning wax, and something else, something metallic, like fear left too long in a locked room. You stepped inside, and all conversation ceased. They had arranged the chairs in a wide semicircle, like a mouth opening to swallow you whole. At the far end stood Father Anselm, spine straight, hands clasped, eyes unreadable. Beside him were two elders, Rebecca, the woodcarver, and John, the elder with the shaking hands whose grandchild you had once delivered during a snowstorm. You remembered wrapping that child in your shawl to keep it warm. John didn't meet your eyes now. No one did. You were offered a chair in the center, a single stool unadorned under the full glow of the candlelight. You sat, not because they asked, but because standing would make you look defiant. And right now, they weren't looking for a woman. They were looking for a symbol, something to explain the unexplainable, someone to absorb the grief no one knew what to do with. Father Anselm began. "There are questions," he said calmly, "that need asking, for the safety of the village, for the peace of the mother." He didn't say Marta's name, that would make it real. The questions came like pinpricks at first, soft, measured. Were there signs the labor was troubled before she called for you? Did the mother scream in pain before the child came? Did you pray with her before you began? You answered them all, yes, no, of course. Then the sharper ones came. Barbed, baited, did you use herbs not blessed by the priest? Have you ever had complications before? Is it true your grandmother was unusual? You felt your chest tighten. Not because of the questions themselves, but because of the way they were delivered, casually, as if this weren't about death and shame and exile, but a village matter, like spoiled milk or a broken fence. You explained, you defended. You said what needed saying, that birth is a fragile thing, that not every child survives, no matter how much skill or prayer is applied, that pain and silence are part of labor, not signs of evil. That you had been trained, not in magic, but in medicine, in instinct passed down through hands that knew the shape of life before it formed. But you knew, as the words left your mouth, that they were not being heard, not truly. You could feel it in the way John rubbed the edge of his sleeve, in the way Rebecca watched the floor instead of you, in how Father Anselm's eyes did not change, not with doubt, not with empathy. He had made up his mind before the candles were even lit. And then when the last question had echoed and the silence had settled, Father Anselm cleared his throat. His voice was almost gentle. "That's what chilled you most. Until this matter is resolved," he said, "we ask that you remain in your home for your safety and ours." A murmur swept the room, not of approval or dissent, but of finality. It was done. The verdict had been spoken. Not in flames or blood, but in exile, isolation, suspicion. With a smile, you nodded, not because you agreed, but because what else was there to do? You rose slowly. Your knees trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. The candles flickered as you passed, casting long shadows behind you that didn't quite feel like your own. Outside, the air had grown colder, as if the world, too, was turning its face away. Behind you, the hall doors creaked shut. And inside, the candles remained, still burning, as if they too were waiting, watching, ready for you to break. They didn't come for you that night or the next. No torches, no mobs. No blood smeared on the doorframe like the old tales warned of. just silence. At first you thought perhaps they had changed their minds, that the council meeting was enough. That being watched, questioned, and dismissed like a stray dog was their version of justice. You tried to believe that, but isolation doesn't scream, it rots slowly. It began in ways so small you almost missed them. The baker stopped including the extra crust he always tucked into your sack. The apothecary, once eager to trade herbs and tinctures, no longer returned your visits. His shop was still open, but only for others. When you walked by, the door shut quickly and his eyes stayed fixed on a shelf that didn't need arranging. The well near your cottage, clean for years, was suddenly declared unblessed. No official word, of course, just whispers. Something's wrong with the water there. The children were warned not to draw from it, not to play near your garden, not to speak your name, not even to whisper it. And when they did speak of you, it was in that dreadful third person, her, the midwife, the one from the woods. As if you had died already and now existed only as a story, a ghost with skin still warm. You heard them choosing another midwife, a woman from the next village over. You watched as they carried Marta's pregnant cousin down the road on a cart, wheels creaking like ribs cracking in your chest. They looked at you as they passed, but not directly. Their eyes slid across your form like rain on stone. No one said thank you, no one said anything. You stayed inside most days, not out of fear, though that too had begun to blossom, but because your hands had forgotten what to do without others. You had spent your life in service to this village. Kneeling by birthbeds, tending wounds, comforting the dying. Now your tools sat untouched, your herbs wilted. Your hands, once praised for their steadiness, trembled when they held nothing at all. It was the forgetting that hurt most. They didn't scream for you to leave, they didn't burn your home, they simply erased you. And yet the nights were not quiet, not truly. You began to hear them, footsteps outside your door long after the last candle should have gone out. Not hurried, not panicked, just slow, purposeful, a pair, sometimes two. Once three, they never knocked, never said a word, but you felt them, standing there, just beyond the threshold. As if waiting to see if you'd open the door and invite your own undoing. And sometimes, only sometimes, when the wind curled through the shutters just right, you heard it. Your name, not shouted, but spoken, low like prayer, like warning. Like accusation, you stopped sleeping. You'd lie on your cot with eyes wide and fists clenched, every board in your cottage groaning louder than it used to. Even the fire, once a comfort, began to feel like an eye watching you. Judging you, flickering in rhythm with your pulse, and worst of all were the dreams. They weren't nightmares, not exactly, more like memories bent out of shape. Marta's face staring at you across a room filled with smoke, the dead baby blinking. Once, just once, a hand grabbing yours in the dark, soft and small, then gone. You'd wake gasping, convinced you had screamed, only to find your mouth sealed shut by silence. You kept a knife under your pillow now. Not because you feared being taken, but because you feared you might reach for something else in the dark, something warm, something impossible, something that whispered to you when you were too tired to resist, something that said, "You know they're right, don't you? You brought him into the world wrong. You let him slip between the veil. You opened something, and now you can't close it. You lit a candle at dawn every morning, not for prayer, but for proof. Proof that you were still here, still breathing, still yourself, but even the flame flickered as if unsure. And you, once the woman everyone trusted to bring life, were now the name they feared would bring death, not by curse, but by being remembered. She came just before dusk, at that strange hour when the sun doesn't set so much as sink, like a stone swallowed by the earth. You almost didn't hear the knock, it was too soft, almost uncertain. The kind of knock that wasn't meant to draw attention, only to ask permission, quietly, while there was still time to run. You opened the door slowly, unsure of what you feared more, another faceless warning left on your doorstep, or a face you once knew now warped by suspicion. But it was her, Marta. Her hood was pulled low, but you'd know her shape anywhere. Thin arms wrapped in a gray shawl. The same shawl she wore the night of the birth. It looked heavier now, like it carried the weight of the child who never warmed beneath it. Her face was pale, not sick, not grieving, but emptied, hollowed out like a shell once filled with song. Her eyes didn't meet yours at first. They searched the trees behind her as though checking to see if she'd been followed. "Come in," you whispered. She didn't move. Instead, she looked up at you, really looked. Her lips trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something older. Older than death, older than fear. "Why did you let me live?" She asked, voice thin as thread. You blinked. "I what?" "That night," she said, after he didn't breathe. "I saw it in your face. You made a choice." Your mouth opened, then closed, because you had made a choice. You chose to lie. To tell her she was safe, to hold her hand and not speak of the silence in your arms, to wrap the child gently and whisper words you didn't believe. You did it for her. You told yourself that. But now she stood before you, asking if it was the wrong thing to do. "Marta," you said gently, "you lost him. You lost something no one should ever have to lose. I wanted to protect you." She stepped closer. "I've been dreaming," she whispered. "Every night at first it was just his name, then it was his face, but last night—" She swallowed hard. "Last night he spoke." Your stomach dropped. Marta looked up again, and this time there was fire behind her tears. "He said I should have screamed louder, that I should have fought harder to pull him back. He said he wasn't ready to go, that someone held him too long on the wrong side." Her hands were trembling now. Her fingers curled around something inside her pocket. You imagined it was the little blue ribbon she used to twist between her knuckles when anxious, but when she drew it out, it wasn't a ribbon. It was a bone, small, smooth, like a wishbone. "Burnt at one end. I found this," she said, "in my bed this morning." You took a step back. She didn't follow. "I didn't tell them I came," she said, eyes darting toward the darkening trees. "They think I'm still at my sister's. But they're watching me too now, watching to see if I'll say something they can use." She pressed the bone into your hand. "I don't know what it means," she said, "but you do, don't you?" You looked at the blackened end, smelled it, ash, earth. "Something else, something wrong. I think he's still here," Marta whispered. "I think part of him never left." She turned to go. You reached for her sleeve. "Wait, Marta, please. Why come to me now?" She paused, her voice cracked. "Because I don't think you killed him, but I think you opened something you didn't mean to." She pulled up her hood again. "And now I think you're the only one who might know how to close it." Then she disappeared into the woods, leaving you with the burnt bone, the fading light, and a truth that clawed behind your ribs. The village was afraid of you, but maybe they should have been afraid of something else entirely. You awoke with dirt under your nails, and the door was open, not wide, just slightly, just enough for the cold to creep in, for the silence to break, for something to have passed through or waited outside. Your hands were trembling. You didn't remember leaving your bed, but your nightdress was muddy at the hem, and your knees ached like they'd been pressed to the ground for hours. You stepped outside barefoot. The air was colder than it should have been. Not just from the wind, but from something beneath it, something watching. The sky hadn't yet turned to morning. It was still that bruised, gray blue of pre-dawn. Fog curled low over the earth like fingers refusing to let go. And then you saw it, a hole, rough, uneven, no more than 2 feet deep, dug in the soft soil next to your garden, right where you used to plant sage and rosemary for pain. You moved closer slowly. Like something was pulling you forward, not with force, but with memory. In the center of the hole was linen, your breath caught, just a corner of it barely exposed. White, though smeared with earth, you knew that fabric. You knew it better than your own hands. You dropped to your knees, and with fingers half numb you brushed back the soil, the texture, the stitching, the blue thread you had used to repair a fray long ago. It was the same cloth. The one you had wrapped around the baby, the one that should have been buried with him, but here it was, cold, still, in your garden. Your heart began to pound, not from fear, but from recognition. Something inside you had known this would come. You just hadn't wanted to believe it. Behind you, something shifted. You turned fast. No one. The porch was empty, the trees still, but the air buzzed with a silence that wasn't empty, it was watching. And then you saw them, footprints. Circling the hole, circling your home, small, bare, human, no deeper than the size of your palm, like a child had walked through the mud during the night, or had been walking, repeatedly, night after night. Your chest tightened. You looked down at the cloth in your hands, now trembling harder. It felt heavier than it should have, as if something still clung to it, as if something hadn't finished letting go. You dropped it, back into the hole, quickly. Not from panic, but from something deeper, shame. You covered it with shaking hands, pushing soil over it with the side of your palm. Each scoop felt like sealing a door you had accidentally opened. And just as your fingers pressed down the final layer, you heard it. A sound, not in the wind, not in the trees, but from inside the earth. A breath, a hiccup, a newborn's cry cut short. You froze, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. And then silence again, but not peace. You stood slowly. Your body was cold, but your mind was burning. The cloth was back, the footprints were fresh, and something was trying to come through, not from the forest, but from underneath. It began with a scream, not your own, a woman's somewhere down the hill, sharp, sudden, so full of terror that it didn't sound like labor, it sounded like death. You were already at the door before your mind caught up, barefoot. Still in the same torn nightdress, your hands remembered before your thoughts did, grabbed the satchel, the cloth, the cord. You didn't stop to wonder why they'd sent for you. Why, after everything, they would still call the one they feared. They didn't. You called yourself, you ran toward the sound. The cottage belonged to Ainlise, young, her first child, the kind of labor that could turn fast from miracle to nightmare, the kind of birth that used to make your heart rise with both dread and duty. But tonight it was only dread. The door was open, the hearth burned low, the room stank of sweat and fear. Ainlise was screaming again, her face slick with tears, her belly hard with effort. Her hands clutching at the sheets like they might pull her free from her own body. No one else was there. No mother, no midwife from the next village, just her and the storm inside her. You moved without permission, without welcome. You pressed a hand to her thigh, felt the angle, the pressure. You whispered low, "It's breach." Her eyes widened, she shook her head, barely able to speak. They said someone else would come, not you, never you. You swallowed hard, but your hands were already in place. There's no one else here, Ainlise. The baby was turned wrong, shoulders caught, head stuck behind the pelvis. It was the kind of birth that broke women open, if not their bodies, then their minds. You reached inside, the baby was still alive. You could feel the kick. You turned him gently, slowly. You had done this before, years ago. You counted your breath. You ignored her screams. You ignored the way her fingers clawed at your wrist. And then he came, slick with blood, coated in heat, and crying, a full scream, angry, demanding whole. You placed him on Ainlise's chest and wiped his face with the edge of your sleeve. He was warm, too warm, but alive. You didn't cry. You didn't smile, you only stared because something felt wrong, not with the baby, with the room, with the silence that followed. Ainlise didn't thank you. She looked at the child as if unsure whether to hold him. And then behind you, a sound, boots. At least 4 pairs, men entered, not villagers, not husbands, watchers. One of them spoke. She wasn't supposed to touch her. Another replied, "Let them see, let them witness." "They didn't take the baby, they didn't take you." They simply stood in the doorway like shadows brought to life. You looked down at your hands, they were red again, different blood, different child, same feeling. You backed away from the bed. No one stopped you, not even Ainlise. As you stepped out, one of the men whispered something you barely heard, but it stuck in your ribs like a splinter. She saved one, but only after losing the other. You ran not because you were afraid, but because you realized something horrible. They had let you do it, let you save one life just to see if it cost another, just to prove their theory, just to feed the myth. They weren't trying to stop you anymore. They were trying to trap you. The smell reached you before the light did, not the acrid bite of firewood, something darker, sharper, like singed flesh, like intent. You followed it through the fog, past your crooked fence. Past the well no one drew from anymore, past the path where footprints no longer came, until you saw it, the tree, the oldest oak in the village. It stood behind your cottage like a sentinel. You used to tie herbs to its branches to dry. Children once carved their names into its bark. Lovers left ribbon knots in spring. Now it was black, burnt from the base up to the mid-trunk like lightning had struck it, but there'd been no storm. No thunder, no wind, only silence and flame. And then you saw what they left behind, your old apron, pierced through with your own shears, nailed into the heart of the charred bark. The same shears you lost weeks ago, the ones with the bone handle. The ones your grandmother had passed down, whispering, "Always use them with clean hands." The apron hung like a corpse, ash clung to the fabric. The cut in its center was precise, not wild, not accidental. A message carved into cotton and smoke: "We see you. We know what you are, and you don't belong here anymore." Your throat closed, you stepped back. The ground beneath the tree was warped, bubbled, blistered. As if something had boiled up from beneath, not burned down from above. No natural fire did this. No accidental blaze scorched in patterns. You knelt beside the roots, and there you found it, buried just shallow enough to be found, a jar. Blackened glass, still warm, inside, ashes, no teeth, tiny ones, scorched, mixed with herbs and hair, your hair, a ribbon from your satchel. You knew the stitch pattern by heart, a curse, a ritual, a warning, not meant for the child, meant for you. You didn't scream, you couldn't, instead you stood, backed away from the tree like it might speak your name aloud. The wind had stopped, not a single branch moved, but the smoke lingered, it clung to your skin, your lungs, your thoughts. And that night, as you tried to sleep, you smelled it again. Inside, you bolted upright. The fire in your hearth was dead cold, but in the corner of the room where your birthing tools used to hang, the wall was smudged with soot. One word finger-drawn, smoky, crooked, childlike, WHY. You didn't sleep the rest of that night, or the night after, because you knew now. They weren't afraid of what happened by accident. They were afraid of what might return by design. And you, no longer the midwife, no longer the healer, were no longer part of the village. You were the threshold, and they had marked the tree not to curse you, but to keep whatever was attached to you from crossing back in. They didn't knock. They didn't call your name, they didn't bring fire or chains or judgment written in ink, but they came. You felt them first, not through the earth or the wind, but in the way your home changed around you. The fire wouldn't light. The shutters refused to close, even the air held still as if holding its breath with you. Then you heard them, footsteps, not hurried, deliberate, boots pressing against damp leaves, each step like a slow drumbeat toward something final. You counted 3, no 4, one lighter, a boy maybe. The same boy who once ran to your door with a fever, and you pressed onion poultices to his chest until the coughing stopped. He had cried into your sleeve. Now he was here to deliver silence. You didn't run, you opened the door before they reached it. Outside, the night was bare, pale from the half-moon. Fog hung low like a veil no one dared lift. There they stood. Father Anselm was not among them, but his absence was more telling than his presence would have been. He no longer needed to speak. He had done enough. He had planted the seed. The village had done the watering, and now they came to harvest. The first man was older, Rebek, the woodcarver. His hands were cracked from years of shaping things, but now they trembled not from fear but from restraint. Next to him, a woman, Miriam. Once a mother you had saved from bleeding out in childbirth. She couldn't look at you. Her eyes were on your feet. The others, shadows, you didn't need to know their names. They were the village now. One of them stepped forward. He held out a piece of cloth, not white, not for swaddling, black, a hood. You stared. He didn't speak. You didn't ask. Instead, you nodded once, slowly, because you knew this wasn't an arrest, it was a ritual. A burial for someone still breathing. They didn't bind your hands. That surprised you. But then you realized they didn't think they needed to. You were already broken in all the ways that mattered. You followed them barefoot, through the fog. Past the burned tree, down the trail that led nowhere in particular, but still felt ancient, like it had always existed for this purpose. No one spoke. The silence was louder than any sentence could have been. It told you what this was. Not punishment, not vengeance, an offering. They weren't afraid of you anymore. They were afraid of what might happen if they didn't do this. You were no longer a woman. You were no longer a midwife. You were a crack in the wall between things that should never touch, and they had come to seal it. At the edge of the woods, they stopped. Rebek handed you a small item. You opened your palm, the shears, rusty, bent, still warm. The same ones nailed into the tree. Your hands closed around them without thinking. Your fingers remembered the shape, the curve of loss. No one told you what to do. You simply stepped forward into the clearing. There was a stone there, flat, gray, worn by years of no footsteps. You knelt, and for the first time in many years you prayed, not for them, not for yourself, but for the child, the one that didn't breathe. The one that might still be breathing somewhere. Then you laid the shears on the stone, and whispered, "I let go." The wind stirred, branches shifted, a shape in the mist, a breath that wasn't yours, and then silence again, not empty but complete. You turned around, they were gone, all of them, vanished into the trees without sound, no footsteps retreating, no whispers, just fog, just the cold, just you. You walked back to your cottage alone, and for the first time in weeks you slept. But in the dream, the baby still waited, still silent, still watching, but no longer angry, just waiting for you to wake up.